in the gilded chambers of the Spanish court, long before the stench of decay would cling to his dying body. A boy named Philip stood at the threshold of unimaginable power. Born on May 21st, 1527, in the stately halls of Valladolid, Philip was not just the son of a king. He was the heir to an empire where the sun truly never set. His father, Charles V, was ruler of the sprawling Holy Roman Empire and King of Spain, while his mother, Isabella of Portugal, was a figure of grace and nobility. From the moment he entered the world, Philip's destiny was carved in stone. He would not be permitted to live a quiet life. The Spain into which Philip was born was flush with power, wealth, and ambition. The spoils of the New World were pouring in gold, silver, spices, and slaves, all feeding the crown's insatiable hunger for dominance. Yet beneath the gold and glory, shadows loomed. Spain was a deeply divided land, its people torn by religious friction, political unrest, and cultural tension. And young Philip, reserved and introverted even as a child, absorbed it all. Unlike his father, who was bold, charismatic, and fluent in several languages, Philip was methodical, solemn, and painfully reserved. He was educated in the strict traditions of Catholic orthodoxy, taught by some of the finest minds of Europe, and drilled daily in Latin, law, history, and governance. He was no warrior prince galloping into battle, but a scholar king in the making, one who would learn to rule through bureaucracy and religion rather than through battlefield heroics. Charles V, ever consumed by his European wars and his quest to suppress the growing Protestant threat, was rarely home. Philip's mother, Isabella, played a formative role in his early life, instilling in him a deep sense of duty and piety. But her death when Philip was just 12 years old left a chasm in his emotional world that never quite healed. In her place stepped cold tutors, court advisors, and endless rules, a crucible that shaped the young prince into a man of unmatched rigidity. By his teenage years, Philip had already begun managing state affairs in his father's absence. While his peers were hunting, jousting, or falling in love, Philip was knee-deep in documents, decrees, and dispatches. He was being prepared for a task of monumental scope, not merely to rule a kingdom, but to maintain control over a global empire stretching from Spain to the Americas, from Naples to the Netherlands, from Milan to Manila. In 1543, at just 16, Philip was married off to his cousin, Maria of Portugal. The union, like most royal marriages of the time, was politically motivated, but it produced a son, Don Carlos, who would later become a figure of tragedy in Philip's reign. Unfortunately, Maria died in childbirth, and with her passing, Philip's already somber disposition grew darker. It seemed grief and responsibility would be the cornerstones of his life. 2 years later, Charles V made the fateful decision that would begin Philip's long and turbulent rule. He named his son regent of Spain, effectively placing the reins of the kingdom into his young hands. While Charles continued to fight wars in Germany and elsewhere, Philip remained behind, governing with meticulous attention to detail and an almost obsessive desire for control. He was efficient and loyal, but also cold and unyielding, a ruler more feared than loved, even in youth. Though still young, Philip's decisions were already shaping the future of Spain. He centralized power, curbed the influence of nobility, and deepened the empire's alliance with the Roman Catholic Church. The Inquisition, already a powerful force, gained new teeth under his command. Heresy, dissent, and rebellion would be met with fire and iron. The people saw him as a divine figure, chosen by God to shepherd the Spanish people. But within court walls, murmurs grew. Was Philip too distant? Too rigid? Could a man so emotionally sealed truly lead an empire built on passion, pride, and blood? In 1554, Philip took another step toward international dominance. He married Mary I of England, hoping to forge a powerful Catholic alliance and strengthen his grip over Europe. But the union was short-lived and unpopular with the English. When Mary died in 1558, Philip lost not only a queen but his claim to the English crown. His dream of a Catholic Europe under one faith and one king began to crack. That same year, Charles V abdicated, retreating to a monastery to live out his final years. And just like that, Philip became king of Spain, Naples, Sicily, Milan, and the Netherlands, as well as ruler over the vast and growing territories in the Americas and Asia. He also inherited the massive debts and the ceaseless wars that came with crown. Philip was now emperor in all but name, a man holding the world in his hands. But the weight of it all, of duty, expectation, and divine destiny, would begin to take a terrible toll. Though the crown sat firm on his brow, cracks were forming elsewhere, cracks deep within his own body. The flesh that bore the power of a king would one day betray him. And as the years passed, the seeds of decay, physical, spiritual, and political, began to quietly bloom beneath his royal robes. When Philip II took full possession of his crown in 1556, he did not do so with celebration or personal ambition. There was no fiery speech, no martial parade, no jubilant proclamation. Instead, the new monarch approached his role with the same cold, measured solemnity that defined his upbringing. For Philip, kingship was not a prize. It was a burden ordained by God. His father, Charles V, had abdicated in exhaustion. Years of war with France, the Ottoman Empire, and the rebellious German princes had worn the emperor thin. He retreated to the monastery of Yusti and left behind a fractured empire split between his brother Ferdinand, who inherited the Holy Roman Empire, and Philip, who became the sovereign of Spain and its colossal overseas dominions. Philip's domain now stretched across continents, one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Yet the Spanish court noticed something odd. The new king rarely smiled. He barely spoke in public. His letters were long, meticulous, and devoid of emotion. Servants and advisors were expected to maintain an almost monastic silence in his presence. In his private chambers, Philip pored over endless documents, treaties, financial ledgers, intelligence reports, and ecclesiastical decrees. He ruled not from the battlefield, but from behind a desk. Philip believed that kings were not simply rulers. They were instruments of God's will. He did not crave glory or conquest, but submission to divine duty. Better not to reign at all than to reign over heretics, he once famously said, a quote that encapsulates the moral rigidity that defined his reign. The monarchy, for Philip, was not about personal gain. It was about enforcing spiritual order. But his piety came with a price. Philip's vision for Spain was uncompromising, a uniform Catholic kingdom under absolute royal authority. This would pit him against rebels in the Netherlands, Protestants in England, and even members of his own court. He micromanaged everything, from naval fleets to the price of grain. Delegation was not his strength. This obsessive control gave him a reputation for being a meticulous administrator, but it also caused delays, frustrations, and endless bureaucracy. Philip II was the sort of king who would stall a military campaign over a misplaced invoice. As the empire expanded, so too did the number of crises. Spain was drowning in gold and silver from the Americas, but the economy faltered under the weight of corruption, inflation, and relentless war spending. The treasury was constantly in debt. The people were overtaxed. Famine and plague haunted the countryside. Still, Philip remained undeterred, clinging to belief that God would reward his steadfastness. In 1561, Philip moved the royal court to a new residence, El Escorial, an austere palace monastery located outside Madrid. It was a striking structure of cold granite and sharp geometry, a reflection of the king himself. There were no lush gardens or ornate chambers, just stone corridors, shadowy chapels, and vast rooms filled with religious art and relics. Philip believed El Escorial would become a symbol of divine kingship. In truth, it became a symbol of his isolation. Unlike charismatic monarchs, such as Elizabeth I of England or Henry IV of France, Philip had no flair for public appearances. He rarely traveled, avoided banquets, and saw diplomacy as a chore rather than a performance. Foreign ambassadors found him distant and inflexible. Yet behind that stern demeanor was a deeply intelligent and calculating mind. He understood European politics better than many of his enemies. What he lacked in charisma, he made up for in ruthless strategy. His foreign policy was defined by three pillars: protect Catholicism, preserve Spanish power, and punish dissent. These goals would eventually lead him into disastrous conflicts: the 80 Years' War with the Dutch, the failed Spanish Armada against England, and intermittent hostilities with France. Each of these wars drained the empire's resources and bled the population dry. But Philip never saw defeat as failure. In his eyes, suffering for righteousness was a form of triumph. Even at home, Philip's rule turned cruel. Under his reign, the Spanish Inquisition reached new heights of terror. Jews, Muslims, and Protestants were hunted with ferocity. Torture chambers and autos de fe, the public burning of heretics, became common. The Inquisition was not merely a religious institution. It was a political weapon used to maintain orthodoxy and crush dissent. Philip did not invent it, but he perfected its machinery. He also faced tragedy within his own family. His only son and heir, Don Carlos, grew increasingly unstable, erratic, violent, and paranoid. Historians now suspect mental illness, but in the 16th century, his behavior was seen as a dangerous liability. When Don Carlos plotted against his father, Philip had him arrested and imprisoned in secret. The young prince died 6 months later under mysterious circumstances, fueling rumors that Philip had murdered his own son. This personal catastrophe was mirrored by political disaster. The Netherlands, a crucial part of the Spanish Empire, erupted in revolt in 1568. What began as a Protestant uprising soon became a full-scale war for independence. Philip responded with brutal repression, executions, military occupation, and scorched-earth tactics. But the Dutch refused to yield. The conflict would drag on for decades, draining the Spanish treasury and dividing Europe further. Philip, however, remained unmoved by blood or defeat. To him, the moral compass of Catholicism justified all means. He believed he was doing God's work, no matter the human cost. But as the wars mounted and the empire strained, the king began to turn inward. His letters became longer, more detailed, almost obsessive. The threads of power were slipping through his fingers, and he responded by tightening his grip. What the world did not see, what his court began to whisper about in hushed tones, was a transformation beginning within the king himself. While he held dominion over empires and crusades, something sinister was taking root within his own flesh. Disease, pain, and rot had begun to fester beneath his robes. Philip II ruled with a mind of iron and a heart of stone. But his body was beginning to betray him. By the late 1560s, Philip II was no longer merely a king. He was an embodiment of a crusade, a man who wore his Catholic faith not just as personal belief, but as political armor, in a world fracturing along the fault lines of Reformation and rebellion. Philip positioned himself as Christendom's last great defender, willing to bleed his empire dry to keep it pure. But every crusade has its cost, and for Spain, and for Philip himself, the toll will be excruciating. To understand the scale of Philip's burden, one must grasp the sheer scope of his dominions. He ruled over Spain, the Kingdom of Naples, the Duchy of Milan, the Netherlands, Portugal, after 1580, and a sprawling overseas empire from the Americas to the Philippines. His ships sailed every ocean. His coinage bore his face on every continent. He didn't merely rule a kingdom. He sat atop the largest transcontinental empire the world had ever seen. But geography was both gift and curse. From the cold Protestant provinces of the Netherlands to the sweltering jungles of New Spain, Philip's empire was connected by distance, language, and belief, and he demanded unity in all three. He insisted on Catholic orthodoxy, Castilian as a dominant tongue, and Spanish-style administration throughout his territories. In doing so, he ignored the complex ethnic and cultural differences within his dominion, provoking unrest in nearly every corner of his empire. Nowhere was this tension more acute than in the Low Countries. The Dutch, prosperous and proud, had little patience for Spanish absolutism or inquisitorial zeal. Many of them had embraced Calvinism, a Protestant sect that Philip viewed as heretical poison. When riots broke out in 1566 and churches were desecrated, Philip responded not with diplomacy, but with brutal force. He sent the Duke of Alba, one of his most ruthless generals, to crush the rebellion. What followed was a reign of terror. Thousands were executed in public squares. Entire towns were razed. The Council of Troubles, nicknamed the Council of Blood, became infamous for its sweeping authority and pitiless judgments. But rather than pacify the region, the violence only hardened the Dutch resolve. The 80 Years' War had begun, a long, bloody conflict that would drain Philip's treasury and stain his reign. Even beyond the battlefield, Philip's rigid religiosity turned potential allies into enemies. His fanatical opposition to Protestantism made him a sworn enemy of Queen Elizabeth I of England, who had re-established Anglicanism after her Catholic sister Mary's death. Relations between the two nations deteriorated rapidly. English pirates, sea dogs like Francis Drake, began raiding Spanish treasure fleets in the Caribbean, and Elizabeth herself supported Dutch rebels with money and troops. But Philip was not content to merely defend Catholicism. He wanted to restore it across all of Europe, and that ambition led him to conceive one of the most daring military gambits in history, the Spanish Armada. In 1588, he launched a massive fleet, over 130 ships, thousands of sailors and soldiers, intended to invade England, depose Elizabeth, and reinstall Catholic rule. The Armada was a logistical marvel, but a strategic disaster. Storms battered the fleet before it reached English shores. English fire ships scattered and burned the Spanish vessels. Communication between ships failed. By the time the remnants of the Armada limped back to Spain, over half the fleet was lost. The defeat of the Armada was a devastating blow, not just militarily, but symbolically. Philip had cast himself as the executor divine will, the scourge of heretics. But now, it seemed even the heavens had turned against him. The Pope, once a vocal supporter, quietly withdrew his backing. European courts began questioning Spain's invincibility. And at home, the Spanish people grew weary of endless war, rising taxes, and imperial vanity. Still, Philip would not relent. In 1590, he intervened in the French Wars of Religion, seeking to prevent the Protestant Henry of Navarre from taking the French throne. He poured money and soldiers into the conflict, even proposing his own daughter as a candidate for queen. But once again, he failed. Henry converted to Catholicism, secured the crown, and ended the war himself. Philip had gained nothing but more debt and more dead sons of Spain. Meanwhile, his once vaunted empire began to show signs of rot. The silver mines of Potosi were producing diminishing returns. Inflation skyrocketed. Starvation swept across the countryside. Famine, disease, and mass immigration hollowed out entire provinces. The empire was eating itself from the inside out, and its king, ever distant, seemed blind to the suffering. It was during this period that whispers began to circulate among the court. The king's once imposing figure had grown frail. His movements were slow, his face pale, his expression increasingly drawn with pain. He rarely left El Escorial, choosing instead to govern from the confines of dark stone rooms lined with crucifixes and relics. While the world burned in his name, Philip slowly crumbled in silence. For all his control, all his piety, and all his precision, Philip was losing everything. The war in the Netherlands dragged on. The Armada was gone. The English pirates continued to raid his ships. And worst of all, the flesh beneath his royal robes had begun to betray him. An infection, a slow, festering torment, had taken root in his body. Philip II, once master of the world, had become prisoner to his own ambitions and soon to his own flesh. The kingdom he had tried so desperately to keep pure was rotting, and so was he. For all his power, Philip II was a man deeply haunted by the weight of empire, the shadow of his father, and the ghost within his own family. The throne may have made him sovereign of a sprawling empire, but it never spared him from loss, betrayal, or the crushing loneliness of royal life. At court, Philip wore the face of an immovable ruler. Behind palace walls, he endured a string of heartbreaks that even the mightiest crown could not protect him from. Born in 1527, Philip grew up in the long, stoic shadow of his father, Emperor Charles V, the most powerful monarch of the era. Charles ruled both the Holy Roman Empire and the Spanish dominions. To young Philip, the emperor was less a father than a looming figure of divine authority. Charles was cold, distant, and obsessed with duty. He raised Philip to think of himself not as a man, but as an agent of God's will. From an early age, Philip was told that personal desires were irrelevant. Love, laughter, and indulgence had no place in the life of a future king. Every lesson reinforced the same truth. The world must be ruled with caution, calculation, and unwavering piety. It was a lesson Philip took to heart, and to extremes. This detachment would later define his relationships. Though he married 4 times, love was rarely the motivation. His first wife, Maria of Portugal, died shortly after childbirth. His second, Mary I of England, was a political match, an alliance to unite two Catholic powers. He barely knew her before they wed, and though she adored him, he remained distant, even cold. After her death, he described her passing as a necessary, if unfortunate, turning of history's wheel. But his third marriage to Elizabeth of Valois, the French princess, brought something different, an unexpected tenderness. Elizabeth was young, vibrant, and intelligent, and she charmed the somber king with grace and laughter. Their union produced two daughters, and for a brief period, Philip seemed softened. Witnesses at court noted that he smiled more often, spoke more warmly, and even joined his daughters in their games. Then tragedy struck again. In 1568, Elizabeth died during a miscarriage. Philip was devastated. For a man trained to repress emotion, his mourning was profound. He withdrew from court for weeks, refusing visitors, lost in prayer and grief. Those closest to him claimed he was never quite the same again. That same year, his eldest son, Don Carlos, descended into madness. Carlos was Philip's only male heir and the symbol of the dynasty's future. But from a young age, Carlos exhibited disturbing behavior. He was volatile, erratic, and sometimes violent. He physically attacked servants and plotted against members of the court. Modern historians believe Carlos suffered from severe mental illness, possibly aggravated by inbreeding among European royal families. In a desperate attempt to protect the throne and perhaps to avoid scandal, Philip had his own son arrested and confined in secret. Rumors swirled throughout Europe. The king had imprisoned his heir. Some claimed he had him tortured. Others whispered that he was murdered outright. The truth remains unclear. What is certain is that Carlos died alone in his chambers, likely from a combination of illness and psychological breakdown. He was only 23. To many, this act sealed Philip's reputation as a cold and calculating monarch who would sacrifice even his bloodline for control. But to those who saw him in private during that period, the picture was more complex. Some reported that Philip wept when Carlos died, that he confessed to priests in anguished tones and spent hours alone in the Escorial's chapel, praying over his son's soul. By the 1580s, Philip had only one surviving male heir, Philip III, born from his fourth and final marriage to his niece, Anne of Austria. The young prince was quiet, obedient, and deeply pious, exactly the kind of son Philip hoped would mirror his own image. But behind the boy's devotion was a lack of ambition, a passivity that worried court advisors. It was clear even then. Philip III would never possess his father's iron will or strategic mind. This growing realization of dynastic fragility, of personal failure, added to Philip's inner torment. For decades he had tried to craft an empire of order and holiness, sacrificing personal joy for spiritual victory. But as his family crumbled and the empire began to unravel, Philip must have asked himself whether the cost was worth it. And then, slowly, his body began to collapse. Chronic gout, a painful inflammation of the joints, had long plagued him. His knees swelled, his feet throbbed, and his hands trembled. Eventually, walking became nearly impossible. Servants had to carry him on a litter, and he sometimes issued orders while reclining in bed, his limbs wrapped in bandages, his face pale and soaked with sweat. The pain was relentless, and the king bore it with grim silence, as though it were yet another penance to be endured in God's name. But the worst was yet to come. The infection that had begun in his lower limbs was spreading. Flesh decayed, skin blackened, and the odor became so overpowering that courtiers fainted when they entered his chamber. His legs, some reported, were riddled with sores infested by maggots. Yet Philip refused amputation. He insisted on facing death whole, no matter how agonizing the cost. It was as if he believed that his suffering served a divine purpose, that his pain, like his policies, was part of God's grand design. Perhaps he thought his afflictions were tests of righteousness. Perhaps, in his final days, he hoped that a lifetime of sacrifice would grant him eternal peace. But the rot was now beyond repair. The king was being devoured from within, slowly, inexorably, and in full view of his court. Spain had grown sick with war, debt, and decay. So had its king. By the 1590s, Philip II's empire, once the envy of Europe, was showing dangerous signs of collapse. For decades, Spain had been held together by a combination of fear, gold, and divine justification. But now, the seams were unraveling. Civil unrest, economic turmoil, religious dissent, and military exhaustion chipped away at the very foundations of imperial Spain. And while the king still clung to his belief in divine order, the world around him was turning chaotic. At the heart of the empire's disintegration was the Dutch revolt, a rebellion Philip had tried and failed to crush for over 3 decades. What began in 1566 as a religious uprising in the Low Countries had mutated into a full-blown war for independence. The Dutch were no longer just rebelling against Catholic orthodoxy. They were rejecting Spanish rule entirely. Philip had sent countless troops and drained the treasury to suppress the revolt. He had installed brutal viceroys, launched campaigns of terror, and tried to install Catholic puppet rulers. But the more he pushed, the more determined the Dutch became. Led by figures like William of Orange and later Maurice of Nassau, they adopted new guerrilla tactics, formed strategic alliances with England, and even developed cutting-edge naval strategies that outmatched Spanish fleets. In 1581, the northern provinces declared full independence with the Act of Abjuration, a formal repudiation of Philip's rule. The king refused to recognize the act, insisting that divine monarchy could not be revoked by mere mortals. But reality said otherwise. By the end of the 16th century, much of the Netherlands was functionally independent, and Spain was hemorrhaging resources just trying to hold on to the rest. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the colonies in the Americas were no longer a source of infinite wealth. The silver mines of Potosi, once a glittering vein of Spanish power, had begun to falter. Labor shortages, indigenous uprisings, and falling yields meant that the flow of bullion to Spain slowed dramatically. Yet Philip continued to fund endless wars, borrowing against future shipments that never came. The crown defaulted on its debts 4 times during his reign. This financial ruin infected every layer of Spanish society. Inflation surged. Bread prices doubled and tripled. Starvation spread in rural areas. Cities like Seville, once bustling centers of commerce, saw entire neighborhoods abandoned. Disease followed famine, and soon the people of Spain began to openly question whether God's chosen king had lost his divine favor. And then came the revolts. In Aragon, tensions boiled over in 1591 when Philip tried to exert greater royal control over the traditionally autonomous region. The people, already suffering under economic strain and fearing the loss of their local laws and privileges, rose up. It was a stunning moment. The King of Spain, challenged not by foreign enemies, but by his own subjects. Philip responded with predictable severity. He sent troops to quash the rebellion and executed key leaders, dissolving many of Aragon's ancient rights in the process. Though the revolt was suppressed, it revealed a deeper truth, that even within Spain, loyalty to the crown was no longer unquestionable. Amid this collapse, Philip's rigid commitment to Catholic orthodoxy remained unshaken. He continued to fund the Spanish Inquisition, rooting out suspected Protestants, Jews, Muslims, and anyone who deviated from his vision of religious purity. Torture, forced conversions, and public executions became spectacles of control, even as they alienated more and more of his people. And still, Philip looked outward, searching for enemies to punish and heresies to crush. In France, he meddled in the wars of religion, backing the ultra-Catholic League and attempting to prevent the Protestant Henry of Navarre from ascending to the throne. Philip's intervention only prolonged the bloodshed. Eventually, Henry converted to Catholicism, took the crown as Henry IV, and negotiated peace on his own terms. Philip had once again spent lives and treasure for nothing. Even more humiliating was his ongoing feud with England. After the disaster of the Spanish Armada in 1588, Philip tried to rebuild his fleet and launch new invasions. But the English navy, bolstered by its own privateers and clever tactics, remained dominant. The cost of these campaigns crippled the Spanish economy. And all the while, English raids in the Caribbean sacked Spanish ports and stole treasure with impunity. By the late 1590s, Philip's empire was a cracked and crumbling mosaic held together by willpower alone. His once glorious fleet was battered. His armies were stretched thin. His people were impoverished. And his dream of a united Catholic Europe had faded into bitter ashes. Inside the somber halls of El Escorial, the king's fortress monastery, Philip remained isolated. He rarely appeared in public, increasingly confined to his darkened chambers. His body, ravaged by disease, now mirrored the state of his empire, decaying, pained, and unable to heal. His legs were now permanently ulcerated, the stench of infection so strong that visitors gagged when approaching his bed. His fingers curled from arthritis, his joints swollen and hot to the touch. Gangrene had set in, but despite all this, Philip refused to abdicate. He still issued decrees. He still demanded daily reports from governors and generals. He still scrawled notes in trembling handwriting, insisting on controlling even the smallest matters of state. His obsession with micromanagement persisted until his very last days, proof, perhaps, that for Philip, rule was not a privilege, but divine obligation, no matter the personal toll. By now, the courtiers whispered openly. Spain was bleeding, and its king, once majestic, now mutilated, was a dying relic of a broken era. Philip II had long believed that his reign was divinely ordained, that every decision, every war, every sacrifice was justified by his sacred duty as God's earthly instrument. But by the end of his life, it seemed that even his own body had turned against him. The monarch who once commanded half the known world now lay captive in a prison of rotting flesh, racked with agony, surrounded by the silence of a court too horrified to speak the truth aloud. For years, Philip had suffered from gout, a disease that inflames the joints and causes intense, often crippling pain. What had started as discomfort in his knees and feet grew into something monstrous. His joints swelled grotesquely. His fingers curled inward, locked in unnatural angles. He could no longer write with ease, nor clasp his hands together to pray, his most cherished daily ritual. And still, he endured it, not because he had no other choice, but because he believed his suffering was a gift from God. Philip saw his pain not as a punishment, but as a divine test, a trial that would purify his soul. He refused opiates or numbing tonics, insisting that he remain lucid to carry out his duties, and receive the full measure of God's correction. When priests offered to pray for his healing, he asked instead that they pray for his humility and endurance. This philosophy of pain, of divine purification through agony, was deeply rooted in the Catholic mysticism that guided Philip's worldview. He was especially inspired by St. Teresa of Avila, who had written of physical torment as a pathway to spiritual ecstasy. To Philip, his pain was not a sign of failure. It was an echo of Christ's suffering, and like Christ, he would not flinch. But no amount of piety could halt the decay. In the final months of his life, infection set in. Open sores developed on his legs, and despite the best efforts of royal physicians, they grew into necrotic ulcers, festering wounds that emitted a sickening odor. Maggots were said to wriggle from the lesions. The room where he lay was filled constantly with the scent of decay, and attendants had to change the bedclothes several times a day. One observer wrote that it was as if the king's body had begun to rot before death had the decency to arrive. Still, Philip clung to control. Each morning, he demanded to be brought reports on the state of the empire, read aloud by trembling aides. His sight was failing. His voice, once commanding, was reduced to a rasp. His orders were often incoherent, but no one dared question him. Ministers recorded his words with solemn nods, only to revise or discard them later. His physical weakness made him paranoid. He ordered inspections of the Escorial's corridors to ensure that no unauthorized persons wandered near his chamber. He demanded multiple confessions per day. Some days, he insisted that priests remain by his side around the clock, murmuring scripture while flies buzzed over his infected limbs. And yet, there was something undeniably tragic about this fall from power. Here was the most powerful monarch of the 16th century, architect of the Spanish Empire, ruler of the New World, vanquisher of heresy, reduced to a hollow husk of suffering and obsessive control. There were days when Philip begged to die. One of his chaplains recorded that the king cried out, "O Lord, how long must I endure? Take me, I am ready." But the Lord did not take him, not yet. The royal doctors, clinging to their professional pride, attempted desperate remedies. They applied leeches to his feet, hoping to draw out the infected blood. They washed his sores with wine. One physician even proposed amputating both legs, but Philip, horrified, refused. "God gave me this body whole. I shall not enter heaven in pieces." Even breathing became painful. The infection spread to his lungs, and fluid filled his chest. He coughed violently through the night, often spitting blood. His skin turned ashen, his lips cracked. At times, he seemed to hallucinate, speaking to people who were not present, his dead wives, his father Charles, even his disgraced son Don Carlos. But Philip had made one final demand, that he die with the full dignity of a king and the full awareness of a penitent sinner. To that end, he ordered his deathbed to be placed in public view, literally. The chamber doors of the Escorial were open to select courtiers and foreign dignitaries, so they could witness the monarch's final days. It was a ghastly spectacle. The king, lying beneath a crucifix, pale and near blind, would raise his trembling hand in blessing to anyone who entered. It was as though he wanted his agony to be a sermon, one last lesson in duty, faith, and the price of kingship. His son, the future Philip III, was brought to his side to watch his father die, to see firsthand what a life of godly rule truly cost. The boy was silent. Some said he wept. Others claimed he looked terrified. On September 13th, 1598, after 53 days of unrelenting agony, Philip II died. His last words were whispered through cracked lips. "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." There was no triumph in his death, only surrender. The empire had survived him, for now, but the man who once commanded continents had finally fallen to the one enemy no king could conquer, his own decaying flesh. When Philip II breathed his final breath in 1598, the sound that echoed to the cold halls of El Escorial was not the roar of mourning, but a long, eerie silence. The empire had waited years for this moment, the death of a king who would rule with iron grip for over 4 decades. Yet instead of celebration or solemn unity, Spain was left with a vacuum, a question, and a ghost that would haunt it for generations. Philip's death marked the end of an era, but it did not bring closure. For those who had suffered under his rule, there was little relief. The wounds he inflicted, wars, purges, economic ruin, were too deep. His obsession with religious uniformity had alienated vast swathes of his subjects. His endless military campaigns had drained the treasury and cost thousands of lives, and the shadow of his legacy lingered over every decision made by his successors. The new king, Philip III, inherited more than just a crown. He inherited a crumbling empire, a people weighed down by famine and disease, and a court suffocating under layers of ceremonial rot and bureaucratic inertia. The younger Philip was nothing like his father, where Philip II was hands-on and overbearing. Philip III was passive, disinterested in governance, and easily manipulated by favorites. In some ways, this shift was deliberate. The people around the new king feared a repeat of the old regime's rigidity. They preferred a monarch who could be guided rather than one who dictated. But this detachment also allowed corruption to fester. The royal favorite, Francisco Gomez de Sandoval, the Duke of Lerma, effectively ruled in Philip III's name. He sold offices, hoarded titles, and made political decisions based on personal gain rather than national interest. The Spanish court, which under Philip II had been a cold machine of control, became a playground for sycophants and opportunists. And yet, the ghost of Philip II was everywhere. His massive palace monastery, El Escorial, remained the symbolic heart of the empire, a looming granite skeleton of his austere vision. There his body lay entombed in the royal pantheon, surrounded by the kings and queens of Spain, beneath altars that spoke of glory, piety, and death. But his presence lived on in more than just stone. Courtiers often whispered about how no decision could be made without asking, what would Philip have done? Foreign ambassadors still spoke of the old king with fear and admiration, and in the countryside, his name was muttered by peasants in the same breath as prayers, some cursing him for the taxes they still paid, others revering him as a sainted figure who had once held the world in his grasp. Even in death, Philip II had power. Historians of the time and those that followed have struggled to define him. Was he a tyrant who sacrificed his people for his pride and his God? Or a misunderstood visionary, a man crushed under the impossible weight of empire? Perhaps he was both, a king consumed by his ideals, who mistook suffering for sanctity and micromanagement for mastery. His policies, both domestic and foreign, would shape Spain's trajectory for centuries. The Dutch revolt he failed to suppress would give rise to the Dutch Golden Age, while Spain continued to bleed resources in a war it could no longer afford. The Armada's catastrophic failure marked the decline of Spain's naval supremacy. The religious intolerance he enforced would culminate in the eventual expulsion of the Moriscos, Muslims converted to Christianity, in 1609, a move that devastated the economy of entire regions. But perhaps the most profound impact was spiritual. Philip had made Spain a beacon of militant Catholicism, and his version of faith was unforgiving. Under his reign, heresy was not a disagreement. It was treason. This absolutist stance hardened the Church's grip on Spain and stifled intellectual progress. Science, philosophy, and literature that challenged orthodoxy were censored or suppressed. A nation that had once produced scholars, explorers, and artists now found itself increasingly isolated. Philip's death, then, was not the fall of man. It was a fading of an ideal. The belief that a single king, by sheer will and devotion, could hold together a vast and complex empire was crumbling. The world was shifting. Power was becoming more diffused. England, France, and the Netherlands were rising. Spain, so long at the center of the stage, was being pushed to the wings. Yet, Spain couldn't let him go. Art and literature of the 17th century frequently depicted Philip as a martyr king, a holy ruler who had given everything for God and country. The Jesuits celebrated him. Painters portrayed him in saintly poses, clutching crucifixes with a look of divine sorrow. Even his painful death was romanticized, as though the worms that had eaten his flesh were symbols of sacrifice rather than decay. But underneath the pious imagery was something darker, a warning. Philip II was the embodiment of what happens when power is unchecked, when faith becomes fanaticism, and when a leader confuses divine right with divine infallibility. His legacy was not just gold and glory. It was fear, rot, and a nation that had sacrificed its future for a fleeting vision of religious empire. The ghost of Philip II never really left Spain. It lived on in the cracked stone of El Escorial, in the paranoia of kings who followed, and in the quiet prayers of those who remembered a time when their king was eaten alive, not just by disease, but by his own impossible burdens. The death of Philip II in 1598 was not just the end of a reign. It was the beginning of a long and slow unraveling. The Spanish Empire, once the envy and terror of Europe, began to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. What Philip had built through sheer determination, religious absolutism, and meticulous control now stood fragile in the hands of a less capable heir and an overstretched government. Spain was entering a period not of renewal, but of quiet decline, and the signs were everywhere. Economically, the empire was on life support. During Philip's reign, the royal treasury had declared bankruptcy 4 times, and the foundation of the Spanish economy had become dangerously dependent on New World silver. But by the turn of the 17th century, even that silver was losing its value. Inflation surged. Prices rose faster than wages. Spanish industries, already weakened by overregulation and the flight of skilled minorities, couldn't compete with the cheaper goods of Northern Europe. Meanwhile, the countryside was suffering. Wars had drained not only the state coffers, but also the population. Fields went untended. Harvests failed. Peasants were taxed to the brink of starvation. Many fled to cities, hoping for relief, only to find urban centers overcrowded and unemployed. Famine and disease were constant companions. Philip II had invested heavily in spectacle. The grandeur of El Escorial, the gold of the churches, the endless processions of religious authority. But behind the golden facade was a kingdom rotting at its core. Under Philip III, these problems only worsened. The new king lacked his father's iron will, and he delegated most responsibilities to his favorite, the Duke of Lerma, whose rule was marked by corruption and nepotism. Taxes were raised again and again to fund unnecessary wars and court extravagance. Entire provinces were pushed to the edge. Even more damaging was the decision to expel the Moriscos in 1609, descendants of Muslim converts to Christianity who had been integrated into Spanish society for generations. Though viewed with suspicion by religious authorities, many Moriscos were skilled artisans, farmers, and merchants. Their removal, about 300,000 people, was a devastating blow to the economy, particularly in Valencia and Aragon. Philip II's dream of a pure Catholic Spain had been realized, but at the cost of its economic future. Militarily, Spain was no longer the undisputed superpower. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 had been the first crack. Philip II never fully recovered from the loss, and though Spain rebuilt its navy, it never regained its old dominance at sea. The 80 Years' War with the Dutch raged on, draining men and money with little to show for it. The once mighty tercios, Spain's elite infantry, were now fighting defensive wars across too many fronts. In Italy, the Spanish grip began to loosen. In the Americas, the administrative demands of the colonies began to outpace Spain's ability to govern them. Pirates, particularly English and Dutch privateers, raided Spanish treasure fleets, and other European powers, especially France and England, began to challenge Spain's influence both in Europe and the New World. The once global empire was increasingly seen as a paper tiger, vast but brittle. Culturally, however, Spain entered what some called a golden age, a final burst of brilliance before the decline became irreversible. Artists like El Greco and Velázquez, playwrights like Lope de Vega and Calderón de la Barca, and writers like Miguel de Cervantes flourished. But their works often carried undercurrents of existential doubt, irony, and subtle rebellion against the rigid piety that had defined Philip II's reign. In Don Quixote, Cervantes created a character who perfectly reflected Spain itself, a deluded knight chasing ideals that no longer matched reality. Quixote believed in a world of noble quests and divine missions, just as Spain believed in its exceptionalism and divine favor. But beneath the humor lay a sobering message. The world had changed, and Spain had not. Philip II had built an empire around a single vision, one of unity, control, and sacred mission. But this vision left no room for diversity, adaptability, or innovation. His successors inherited not just land and titles, but an inflexible system, a crumbling economy, and a population exhausted by war and spiritual austerity. And so, the decline continued, not with grand fall, but with a slow fading of glory, like a candle burning too brightly. The empire Philip II had pushed to its zenith now flickered in the winds of change. Other nations rose. Other ideas took hold. The Enlightenment was on the horizon, and the old faith-driven empires would soon find themselves out of place in a new, more secular world. But Spain would cling to its past. It would continue to build monuments, hold ceremonies, and speak of its former greatness. And in every gilded hall and echoing chapel, Philip's ghost remained, a reminder of what had been gained and lost in pursuit of divine empire. When we speak of Philip II's reign, the headlines often highlight his imperial conquests, religious zeal, and political might. But behind the grandeur lies a much darker story, one of humans suffering on a staggering scale. The legacy of this monarch was not just carved into treaties or painted on cathedral walls. It was etched into the lives of millions of ordinary people, peasants, soldiers, heretics, and colonists who bore the brunt of his relentless policies. Philip II's Spain was a kingdom ruled by fear and discipline. His government's obsession with religious uniformity meant that the Inquisition was more than a spiritual court. It was a tool of terror. Thousands were accused of heresy, witchcraft, or simply of harboring suspicious beliefs. Trials were secret, punishments brutal, and sentences often fatal. The public executions, burnings, and imprisonments created an atmosphere where suspicion could turn neighbor against neighbor. Families were torn apart, reputations destroyed, and a culture of silence enforced. Religious persecution was not confined to Spain itself. Philip's campaign against Protestantism was fierce and unyielding. The war in the Netherlands, initially sparked by resistance to heavy taxation and religious repression, turned into a bloody, decades-long conflict. Cities were sacked, populations displaced, and thousands died in battles or from famine caused by the war. This conflict drained Spanish resources and left scars that would last centuries. But the human cost was not just in war and persecution. Philip's imperial ambition stretched across the globe, and the Spanish colonies were often scenes of cruelty and exploitation. Indigenous populations in the Americas suffered devastating losses from disease, forced labor, and violent conquest. The encomienda system subjected native peoples to harsh treatment under Spanish landholders, and missionaries aggressively tried to convert them, often disregarding native cultures and traditions. At home, economic hardship compounded the suffering. Peasants worked land that was heavily taxed and often mismanaged. Crop failures led to famine. Cities grew crowded and unsanitary, breeding grounds for diseases like the plague and typhus. The nobility and clergy lived in opulence, while the vast majority struggled to survive. Soldiers who fought in Philip's endless wars also paid a steep price. The famed tercios were brave and disciplined, but many were sent into hopeless battles, poorly supplied and inadequately paid. Death was a constant companion on the battlefields of Europe, North Africa, and the Americas. Veterans returned broken, if they returned at all, and their families were left destitute. Philip II himself was a man who suffered physically and emotionally. His painful final years, marked by obesity, infections, and a grotesque condition that eventually led to his being eaten alive by his own body, can be seen as a tragic metaphor for the toll of absolute power. His body, like his empire, was deteriorating from within. The psychological effects on the population were equally profound. The intense pressure conformed to a strict Catholic orthodoxy, suppressed creativity, debate, and dissent. Fear of the Inquisition stifled innovation and critical thought. This intellectual stagnation delayed Spain's adaptation to the changing world, even as other nations embraced new ideas and technologies. Yet, despite this suffering, many Spaniards remained fiercely loyal to their king and faith. Philip's image as a devout and pious ruler inspired deep reverence. His insistence on Catholic unity was seen by some as a necessary shield against the chaos engulfing much of Europe. For these supporters, Philip was a martyr who sacrificed personal happiness and even his health for the good of Spain and Christendom. But history judges not only by intentions, but by outcomes. The human cost of Philip II's reign is a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute monarchy, religious fanaticism, and imperial overreach. It reveals how the ambitions of a single man can shape the destiny of millions, sometimes at a terrible price. As we look back, we must remember the faces behind the history books, the mothers, children, soldiers, and peasants who lived and died in a Spain transformed by the will of its devoured king. As we come to the close of Philip II's story, it's clear that his life and reign offer more than just historical facts. They present a powerful lesson about leadership, ambition, and the limits of power. Philip II ruled Spain at its height, overseeing a global empire stretching across Europe, the Americas, and beyond. His reign was marked by intense religious devotion, unyielding control, and an obsession with legacy. Yet, despite his efforts to create a perfect Catholic empire, his policies planted the seeds of decline, and his physical and mental decay mirrored the fragility of his realm. The image of Philip II, eaten alive by his own body, remains a chilling metaphor. The insects and infections that consumed his flesh reflected a deeper rot within the political, social, and spiritual fabric of Spain. His relentless drive for control strangled flexibility and diversity. His rigidity left Spain ill-prepared for the modern world, emerging beyond its borders. Philip's life was a testament to the perils of absolute power wielded without compromise or compassion. His reign shows how even a ruler with the most meticulous plans could be undone by the unforeseen consequences of those plans. The empire he built was vast, but it was brittle. The very factors that made Philip II a formidable king, his dedication, his piety, his resolve, also blinded him to necessary change and adaptability. In the centuries after his death, Spain's decline continued. Wars dragged on, finances crumbled, and other European powers overtook its global influence. Yet, Philip's vision lived on in culture and memory. The grand buildings, the art, and the literature of Spain's golden age were both a tribute and a eulogy to his reign. Modern historians have wrestled with his legacy. Some view him as a visionary leader who strove to hold together a fracturing Europe and preserve a faith under siege. Others see a cautionary figure, an emblem of fanaticism and authoritarianism. Most agree he was a complex man, a ruler whose achievements and failures are inseparable. But beyond politics and power, Philip II's story resonates on a deeply human level. It reminds us of the vulnerability behind the crown. Despite his majesty, he was mortal, subject to pain, decay, and death like any other. His physical decline, public and gruesome, stripped away the illusion of invincibility and exposed the man beneath the legend. For us today, his story prompts reflection. What does it mean to lead? How do ambition, faith, and power shape a person and a nation? And how do the choices of one individual ripple through history, touching countless lives? Philip II's reign was one of extremes, great achievements shadowed by profound suffering. It was a reign where the line between sanctity and tyranny blurred, and where the king who once ruled the world was ultimately undone by his own body and vision. As the dust settles on his monumental legacy, one truth remains clear. The story of Philip II is not just a story of a king eaten alive by insects. It is the story of an empire, a people, and a time when the old world was fighting desperately to hold on to its place in history. Thank you for joining the Crit Stories on this deep dive into the life and death of Philip II. If you found this exploration compelling, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about Philip II's legacy? Was he a visionary or a cautionary tale? We'd love to hear your perspective. Until next time, keep seeking the stories beneath the surface.